this just applies to people with eating disorders. I think this is good advice for anybody. Hello, it's Uncovery podcast. My name is Maddie and welcome back to another episode. This was originally intended to be a little bite, but then I started recording it and it is a full-blown episode. But I think it's important because it is about the holidays and Christmas and events and how to navigate that when you have an eating disorder, because it can be really, really, really challenging through this time of year. And we're right in the middle of it. We're like in December. So I thought it was imminent that we kind of get this out, because I think there could be some really helpful information for people that either have one or love somebody that's going through this. In, recent news with me, a couple of wins. I've been cooking more meals. One of my sort of safe food habits is I eat a lot of raw food. I eat a lot of raw vegetables, raw fruit, cold foods. I don't cook a lot of different types of foods, or I haven't been. And so that's something that I've been stretching and pushing and doing more of. So that's a bit of a win. I've been doing that. In the evening, it's particularly hard. I find it really difficult to like feel full of warm, hot, heavy feeling food. So that's something that in my body I experience, and it kind of creates that anxiety after eating that I then kind of have to sit with and sit through. But I've been doing it, and this thing that I've been thinking about is that it takes a long time when you are a person that eats regularly and eats normally to like prepare food and cook food. And I have cooked a lot in the past, and I'm a decent cook actually, but I sort of forget how long and how much effort it takes, and then how much cleanup you have to do. And I'm like, oh my God, people have to do this all the time. But I have been pushing that. And as a result of that feeling of sitting in it and sitting with it, I kind of found this anxiety hack, especially if you have anxiety that ramps up at night. That's really where this will help. Is I will go for a little walk just around the block, just like around my neighborhood, not in like a compulsive movement sort of exercise type of way to be like, oh God, I ate and so I got to go burn this off. It's like, no, it's like a very like calm, chill, solo walk to go look at Christmas lights. And there's something about, I think, the cold air and the quiet, and obviously looking at Christmas lights, because if you know anything about me, and if you don't, now you'll know, I am a Christmas fanatic. I love, 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 love Christmas. My family calls me Maddie Loo-hoo around the holidays. And so going on a little walk and just seeing the lights in my neighborhood, I find that really helps to kind of ease the anxiety. And so whatever it is that you're feeling anxious about, if it happens to be in the evening or it gets worse at night, I think a lot of people perhaps get worse anxiety at night, then that's a little life hack that I found really has been working for me. So let me know if you try that. It gets you out of your head and into a little bit of the sparkly season. I have a great neighborhood for Christmas lights is what I've actually learned by doing that as well. So there's that. On one of these anxiety depleting walks, I was walking past this house and I looked in the window and it was all kind of like lit up and they had their little Christmas tree, and there was this group of people. So I think like two couples looked like, just, I wasn't like stalking them. I wasn't like standing there watching who they were, but it was, 4 people, I think, sat around a table having a meal. And I felt this overwhelming grief in that moment, because I was watching basically from the outside, literally looking in, what so many people have happen so normally and so easily, so often, every day. people that can sit down to meals socially and interact with their partners and their friends and their loved ones without thinking so much, without planning so much, and have that feel easy. And it felt incredibly isolating just in that moment. And that doesn't happen to me a ton, where I feel so apart from the world as a result of my eating disorder. But I think that's also a result of just dealing with it for so long that the way that my life looks, it becomes really normalized to me. There's so much hope that I feel right now when it comes to recovery, and so much purpose that I feel in it. But I did want to highlight this like really, really tough and grieving moment that I had. This idea that like you're missing out on your life, like this half life it actually does make a difference in the way that you spend your time and who you spend it with. So that was a little bit of grief for me. But at the same time, I think it also allows me to then reflect, double down, and be like, this is why you're doing this. This is why you're creating a life that doesn't include you missing out on stuff or doing less of those things that you want to be doing. So hopefully it can be, more of an energizing or purposeful take than just the sad that kind of came up at the time. But it's not all rainbows, butterflies, and Christmas lights in recovery. It's a lot of hard and sad moments too. Speaking of Christmas and Christmas lights, the holidays are really hard for a bunch of reasons for people that have eating disorders. Like for most people, it's a really wonderful time of year, and there's families and friends and socializing and celebrations, and there's a lot of coming together to share food. And it can create this environment for people with eating disorders that feels like the most stressful time of year at the same time, because this sort of orbiting around food and focusing so much on food really magnifies all of the ways that people with eating disorders struggle. So there's a few different aspects to this, which is just, first of all, the prevalence of food. So it's everywhere, right? There's all kinds of different like holiday meals and snacks, and there's food out and drinks, and there's always stuff being kind of offered around the holidays. So for sort of an analogy, somebody that is an alcoholic, for example, they can do their best to avoid situations where people drink and can completely abstain from any drinking at all. People that gamble can avoid casinos. But if you have an eating disorder, you will face your biggest fear multiple times a day, every single day. And so to have a period of time like the holidays where that's then exacerbated and there's even more sort of surrounding you, so sort of more food, it can be really, really anxiety provoking, really difficult. Perhaps not for everybody, but definitely for a lot of us. And definitely I've experienced this, and I do experience this. Now, in addition to just there being a lot more food around, there's also a ton of messaging around this time of year about our bodies, calories, how unhealthy food is, and this idea of, oh, well, you would need to do this much exercise to burn off that Christmas cookie, or, eggnog has this many calories, like blah, blah, blah. And there's so much of that because all of that diet industry stuff, those companies all make a ton of money off of people engaging in the 30-day fitness programs or getting a gym membership in January. And there's a real difficulty to try and not engage in that type of headspace when it's even more prevalent during this time of year. So all of that, your body isn't good enough if you're losing control and indulging in your favorite foods or foods you love over the holidays. You're not good enough. Your body's not good enough. You need to be tightening up that diet later. And people do this interpersonally, and people do this at a societal global scale too. So there's comments that people will make either about each other's food or about themselves, being like, oh, I'm so bad for this, or things like that. And so I'll talk about a couple of things that will help if there's somebody that has an eating disorder that you want to support well, or not, or just like for the good of everybody, some things that maybe we could just stop doing. And the other thing that makes it really difficult to have an eating disorder around the holidays, and this can definitely be the thing if people know that you have an eating disorder, is that there's this view or this myth that you should be indulging, that this is such a great opportunity to just eat those, hard foods that that you don't usually eat, or, what an opportunity to challenge yourself. And that's like a really difficult misconception, because this isn't really the time for that. There's a lot of extra anxiety and extra feelings about food during this time. And so, people being like, oh, great. Well, then, you're trying to gain weight. So you'll get to eat all of this amazing, rich food and all these Christmas cookies, and that'll help you. And it's like, you're kind of missing the point. Like that's really, really stressful. And unfortunately not that helpful to hear. And so I've been thinking about this obviously a lot in the run up to Christmas. And it actually reminded me of this story that I've shared before on a blog that I had. And it's about an experience that I had my very first Christmas in recovery. And I'm probably going to just read a bit of this verbatim, because I think it encaptures what kind of went on really well. But I think it helps to kind of explain what the internal experience is for somebody with an eating disorder during this time. I think it was Christmas Eve, and the fact that I can't be sure is actually terrifying to me, because I've always convinced myself that I never got so sick that my brain wasn't fully functioning. But I'd only been in recovery for a few months, and it had gotten worse before it was getting any better. So because of our similarities, my dad and I are both up very, very early in the morning. And the difference, unfortunately, is that I needed to get up and exercise if there was going to be any shot of me eating what I was quote unquote supposed to for that day. So I needed the treadmill. And my dad promised that if I came home for Christmas, he'd have it set up to make me feel safe. Safe like the vegetables and the berries and the unsweetened almond milk and pretty much nothing else that I was having at that point. So he had brought the treadmill out, but the treadmill wasn't working that morning, Christmas Eve. And I was too sick to understand. It was probably before 7 a.m., but I was not relaxing into the holiday, my favorite day of the whole year. I was so stricken with panic, and I went to my dad and I was demanding that we fix the treadmill, because how can someone live without cardio? And how can you expect me to get through the day if I haven't earned my place in the world by continuing to shrink further away from it? At some point, he got so frustrated, and his patience was worn thinner than me or the last threads of his sanity watching his little boo slowly kill myself. And he asked me why I couldn't just ease up a little bit, for God's sake. And in that moment, I broke down. I was so fragile in my emotions. I was as fragile in my emotions as I was in my body. I was sobbing uncontrollably because Christmas was my favorite, and now it was all ruined because Christmas Eve didn't start right, and I could never really recover from that. Only months later would I begin to understand how confusing it must have been to love somebody with a BMI that's bordering on hospitalization, who could so relentlessly demand the use of a treadmill if she was going to spend Christmas somewhere. And I remembered when we bought the treadmill, we had trekked up to like God knows where in the northeast of Calgary to a stranger's house that we had found on Kijiji and paid a couple $100 and hauled this ridiculous thing into the back of my parents' SUV and hauled the ridiculous thing into their house and hauled it down the stairs. And we laughed the whole time because it was so silly. It was in mint condition, and my anorexia was absolutely thrilled because I could exercise whenever I wanted, no matter what. And I am so sorry that I made him buy that treadmill. After this breakdown in the kitchen over the Christmas Eve morning treadmill, he was so quick to apologize. He apologized immediately. He hugged me. He told me he loved me. And he told me that we were going to have a great Christmas. And he told me he knew how hard I was working on recovery and that he was so sorry and that it must be so overwhelming. And the next morning, Christmas morning, was the first Christmas breakfast we'd had as a family in 6 years. And so it ended up being this Christmas that I will never forget for all of the sort of beautiful and tragic and bittersweet reasons, because it did end up being a great Christmas. But it was an opportunity for me to then later reflect and understand just how difficult it must be, not just for people with eating disorders to go through the holidays, but for their loved ones to watch them try and navigate that space. And so hopefully I can now give you some tips on how to navigate the holidays as a loved one that's trying to support someone with an eating disorder, or just in general, how can we better approach the holidays to take the sort of shame and guilt and focus out of food and our bodies and all of that stuff. So I kind of started talking about this at the beginning, but because it's so counterintuitive, I'm going to say it again. But the cheerleading and the sort of challenging and pushing the recovery during the holidays can actually kind of have this backfiring or negative effect, because it sort of just adds attention and stress around the eating disorder. And there's lots of other days to be doing that, to be challenging and pushing and getting out of those habitual modes that somebody with an eating disorder has. But a better way to approach it is just to ask the person, how can I support you? What do you need from me during this meal? Or what would make this easier for you? Because then it opens up the conversation in order for them to respond and say, this would be really helpful to me, or having this set aside, or having this like this. And everybody's individual needs are going to be different. So it allows them to share with you what's actually going to be helpful for them. Now, overall, avoiding talking about dieting, avoiding making weight comments, shape comments, calorie comments, food comments in this sort of guilty or shameful way, that's a huge, huge help. It doesn't have to be the focus of every conversation to talk about the food. And you can talk about like, oh, this is yummy, this is great. Like, of course, we want to appreciate the meals and the time that we spend together. But without focusing on like things like physical appearance or saying, oh, you look so this or you look so that. Just take the focus kind of away from that. This is just like a universal truth, but you can give people so many compliments that have nothing to do with what their body looks like or what they look like at all. You can tell them that they light up a room and that they are so funny and brilliant. Like, I mean, there's a million, I don't need to tell you, I probably had to compliment people, but we don't need to always be focusing on the way that people look when we're praising them, because people have so much more to offer. It is often helpful, and this won't be, realistic for everyone, but it's at least something that you could ask the person that has the eating disorder whether or not it would be helpful to have meals served in the kitchen rather than having it either family style or out on the table. Now, not everybody will care about this. Not everybody will need that kind of facilitation, but it's just an idea, because having so much food just like around and visible might be difficult for some people. I remember when I was first in recovery, Something that really helped me was not to have sort of like these nibbly foods out all the time. I was able to navigate it in the holidays because I sort of just accepted it as a reality. And then I just did my own sort of like mental work and coping to kind of deal with it. Cause I just didn't want to bother people by, asking them to accommodate my needs, which I don't know, that's good and bad to that. But having little like nibbly things and appetizers and finger foods out used to be really, really difficult for me. Like I would almost use the T word, the trigger word. That was a really, really difficult one for me because so much of my own pattern of behavior back then, was to pick and nibble at food and never have meals. So me trying to then shift into having more regular meals, being more mindful about my eating, meant that then going back into that pattern and habit of that picking, nibbling, a little bit of this, a little bit of that was really, really hard for me at that time. But again, that's something that if you're having some kind of dialogue with somebody that might be suffering with an eating disorder, or at least something to be aware of, that kind of open access, like so much food everywhere, can be really, really difficult. So at least being mindful of that can be helpful as well. So at the end of the day, another really important one for loved ones of somebody that has an eating disorder is like, you really need to also take care of yourself. Asking for help, asking for resources of your own in navigating this, because when you're watching somebody that's struggling, it's really, really hard on you too. And I know that. And I had that experience with my dad where like that became really, really clear to me that like desperate need to be like, how can I make you well? How do I help you? Watching this person struggle, and really not knowing how. So make sure that you're taking care of yourself too, and accessing resources that will help you navigate the holidays too, because it can be a stressful time for anybody, right? Like it's anxiety provoking for a lot of people. Okay, so as a person with an eating disorder, or if you're struggling with food, I think there's some really important things that you can do to navigate the holidays. And the first one really is to have a plan. Planning ahead is kind of your best friend, I think. Embrace as much of the joy and the activity as you possibly can, but also know that, especially in certain phases of recovery, having ahead of time, knowing what your meals are, knowing when they are, can help to decrease that chaotic feeling that the holidays can bring with all that food being around. So making a really solid plan is, I think, number one. And part of that plan is proactively thinking ahead about the things that might actually come up, or the things that might actually trigger you. So having this, if this, then this, for things like if somebody makes this kind of comment about my weight, I will say even those little mental exercises of planning ahead are really, really helpful. And part of that planning ahead, I think, includes having a support person or a support system, or knowing who those people are that are either going to be present there wherever you are, or are accessible via call or text if things might come up. So if you become super overwhelmed and you need to tell somebody, or you need to leave the room or something like that, you can know that there's somebody there that will either come talk to you and affirm, or that at least knows what's going on if you kind of give them the signal, and then they'll just be able to, I don't know, cover for you, or whatever it is that you've agreed. But just knowing that you have a person that understands what you're going through and is either going to be there present, or is at least accessible, to kind of give you those words of encouragement if things come up, that'll be really, really helpful. I don't think this just applies to people with eating disorders. I think this is good advice for anybody, but there's so many parties and there are so many people in town, gift exchanges, let's go for drinks, let's go for coffee. And it can get really overwhelming, not just for people with eating disorders, but specifically when you need to say no to something, know that that's okay. I'm only just now really appreciating the value of boundaries and being able to prioritize the things that I'm doing. And part of that is just because, especially during this period in recovery, there's a finite amount of time, attention, and energy that I have, and that anybody has at any time. And knowing that I can't really afford to have a whole bunch of my energy sort of leak out by spreading myself too thin, because I need to focus on what's really important. And part of that is eating when I need to, resting when I need to, and doing the things that I need to do. So that means that maybe I can't say yes to everything that I want to. And maybe that will actually decrease my anxiety about feeling like I need to be at every single thing. You can still have an incredible holiday season without saying yes to every single social event. Like, we've all had those seasons of holidays where we're done and we're like, oh my God, I'm so exhausted. And sometimes that's fine. And sometimes then you recoup later. But this obligatory, I must do every single thing actually kind of sucks the fun out of things sometimes. And that's, I think, just for everybody. I think that's just universal advice. So along with those boundaries also kind of comes an exit strategy. So there should always be sort of like an emergency exit that if things really do get too much in any particular situation for someone, if you're suffering with an eating disorder, putting sort of bookends around your time, saying, oh, I can stay until this time because you need to go and have, your planned meal that maybe you're not having with these people or things like that. Asking somebody to call you at a certain time, or say, hey, can you call me if I need you to, so I have a reason to kind of leave. Like, that's actually justifiable. If you don't feel like talking about the fact that you have an eating disorder and that's why you're uncomfortable and you're leaving, it's okay to have an exit strategy to take care of yourself. That's really important. A couple of just really practical tips are to eat regularly. So this thing that we tend to do, or that I definitely have tended to do, which is to not eat all day because you're having a big meal at the end, or, oh, well, I ate this at this time, so I'm not going to eat at that time. Eating regularly, especially in eating disorder recovery, is crucial. So sticking to the plan that you already have, if you have a meal plan or that regular interval pattern of eating, is so, so important, because otherwise you'll be hangry, you'll have higher anxiety. It'll end up feeling like a mental game the whole time. And so what part of that might actually look like is bringing your own food in some instances to events. I had to do this at the beginning of recovery all of the time. And at some point I just had to like kind of accept that I was going to be that weird person that sometimes brought their own food. And if it can be like a shared dish that other people would want to have too, but like taking one or two food items that are good and safe and part of like what you're already eating, then worst case scenario, if the food that's there is just not going to work, then at least you have something. So you're not eating, so you are still eating. And this might not apply to everybody, but like any of these things, it's a bit of a take what you need and leave the rest. But alcohol and eating disorders have a really ugly relationship in some cases. So the disinhibition that comes with drinking can lead to more eating disorder behaviors such as binging and purging, or if you're restricting, sort of replacing food with alcohol and not eating as a result. I think I'll have an entire episode about what we would call drunkorexia, but it's something that we really struggle with. And then in addition, all of the sort of calming, rational thoughts that we're trying to encourage in ourselves to get through the holidays, and to have these events go well without having a whole bunch of anxiety, alcohol is going to do the opposite of that. We all know that rational thought is not exactly readily accessible to us when we're drinking. If anybody's ever had alcohol, that's probably something that you've experienced. So be mindful about alcohol. It doesn't mean that nobody can drink at the holidays, but it's just something that for some people might end up helping with. And so I feel like maybe this sounds like some kind of laundry list of rules around like, oh, we can't do this, and we can't do this around the holidays with eating disorders. But it's actually just some ideas, it's stuff that's helped me a lot, and that it's helped me a lot to share with loved ones that that's my experience and that there's some things that they can do that would help me. What that means is that then on the day and at the events and through the holidays, then we just get to enjoy it because we've sort of thought ahead a little bit about how to make a good plan and what this particular person might need. And then you can really just enjoy the best parts of it. All of the great heartwarming, heart-filling, grow your heart 3 sizes type of Christmas experience that hopefully lots of us can have and like having. then those are much more readily accessible to us if we're not caught up in so many of the eating disorder things that can come up around the holidays. So this, I hope, is helpful as we kind of continue on through the holiday season and beyond, because really when we think about life and events that come up, a lot of these things can help with those as well. And so what I'll do is there's actually some resources that I have that I will post on the resources page of uncoverypod.com to point you to either these articles or these lists of little helpful reminders or things that people can do either as a loved one or as somebody that's struggling. And so, yeah, the originally intended little bite ended up being quite a big bite, but there's so much to the holidays and Christmas, and I hope that this can help you have an even warmer, even merrier one. And I hope your heart grows even more than 3 sizes. I know that when I think about this story with my dad, mine definitely does. And so I wanted to say an extra thank you to Dad. I couldn't do any of this without you. And thank you for letting me share that story. I always check with people before I share to make sure that it's okay. And I hope that can help somebody else. So I love you all. Merry Christmas, and we'll see you on the next episode.